civil air transport and later dubbed Air America, that would be the subject of a 1990 movie by the same title. In 1954 the CIA used Honduras to topple the government of Guatemala. A series of graft and drug scandals in Honduras brought down the leadership in the 1970s, but the CIA ensured that Honduras would be a main staging point for actions in nearby Guatemala and Nicaragua. When the showdown came with the D, which was making the CIA uncomfortable, it was the D office that closed. 17 Despite the so-called war on drugs, the drug-free plan was much less important than the agenda of United Fruit, its shareholders, and the CIA. The Bush connection. George Bush is best known he about taxes eclipses his other great he. Take my word, this scourge will stop, which was part of his inauguration speech. The amount of American heroin addicts, which dropped the power of the new Skull and Bones 297 from 500,000 to 200,000 in the years after Vietnam, rose sharply again after America through the CIA lent assistance to Afghanistan. The CIA backing of the opium growers fooled few. The President's Strategic Council on Drug Abuse was frustrated enough by the CIA's silence on the issue that it pointed out in a New York Times editorial that drug use would rise just as it did with the CIA adventures in Laos. The prediction was correct, as the addict census grew to 450,000 and heroin deaths in New York rose 77%. A creative form of the Skull and Bones constructive chaos had the government spending billions to fight a war on drugs and billions more to jail users, while making the world safe for drug lords from the Afghan hills to the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia and the Honduran coast. George Bush, George W. Bush, and Dick Cheney. The Bush tradition in the Skull and Bones began with George's father, Prescott, who was a bonesman and served in Army intelligence. At the wedding of Prescott Bush and Dorothy Walker, 5 bonesmen served as ushers. Bush family members were close to the Rockefellers and Harrimans, and served on numerous corporation boards. George Herbert Walker Bush was born and raised in Greenwich, Connecticut, and schooled at Andover and Yale. With money from the owner of the Washington Post and connections from family and his Bones cabal, George headed to Texas to make his fortune. Bonesman Henry Neil Mellon, one of 4 Mellons in the group, gave George the chance to learn the oil business through his company, Dresser Industries, which had been bought from its founding family by Mellon with Harriman money. After George's apprenticeship at Dresser he started his own company, Zapata Oil, with 2 partners. Zapata Oil drilled in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. The company's island base in the Casal Bank would be used for CIA operations against Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was actually known as Operation Zapata. 2 vessels used in the operation were Barbara and Houston, the names of George's new wife and newly adopted home base. 19, while it is 298 from the sacred to the profane generally denied. George's CIA career began at this time, and he was still active in the organization in 1963. He later became director of the CIA. George W. Bush's career went according to the same game plan as his father's with the exception of CIA involvement. George W. went to Yale, was a member of the Skull and Bones, worked in the oil business, and then moved into politics. In the 2000 presidential race he picked Rick Hard Bruce Cheney as his running mate. Although the soon-to-be vice president was not a bonesman, there are 9 Cheneys in the membership list of the Skull and Bones. The Cheney ancestor who came to America in 1667 landed in Massachusetts, entitling the family to be counted among the Blue Bloods. Like George H. W. Bush, Cheney was connected to military intelligence, and he was a strong supporter of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Cheney was even George's Secretary of Defense during Operation Desert Storm. Cheney too went to Texas, where he became the head of Halliburton, an oil drilling company that bought Dresser Industries in 1998 under his tenure as boss. The company's Brown and Root subsidiary remains an important campaign donor, now to Republican candidates, rather than to Democrats, and a beneficiary of large government contracts. The Bones and the October surprise. In November 1980 President Jimmy Carter, who had so far survived 2 assassination attempts, and the intrigues of a powerful machine he could not fully comprehend, lost the presidential election. The powers that were had thrown their weight behind the charismatic Ronald Reagan and bonesman George Bush. But what the Republicans feared the most was that the hostage situation in Iran would end just before the election. Despite the constant mismanagement by the Carter White House, a last-minute release of the American hostages, the October surprise, could spike Carter's popularity enough to carry the election. The conspiracy theory covered in numerous books tells the story of George Bush, fellow Bonesman Senator John Heinz High, and a hand the power of the new Skull and Bones 299 full of intelligence operatives flying to Spain to meet with members of Iran's government. The deal was that Iran would hold the hostages until after the election in exchange for arms. This deal would also start the strange Oliver North Iran-Contra affair that was unearthed years later. After the election, a series of murders and strange deaths began that included Reagan's campaign manager and spy master William Casey, Eminem Noah, an Israeli officer, arms dealer Cyrus Hashemi-20, and broadcast journalist Jessica Savage. In a remarkable coincidence, Senators John Heinz and John Tower were killed in separate plane crashes within hours of each other in April 1991. Both were allegedly connected to the October surprise, and both were powerful men in the Senate. The father of Senator Heinz was John Heinz II, who was a Skull and Bones member in 1931. John III, Prince of the Heinz Ketchup Company fortune, married Teresa Simões Ferreira, who was born of a Portuguese family in Mozambique, which at the time was still a colony. Ferreira, a board member of the Carnegie Institute, a member of the Brookings Institute, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, suddenly inherited a fortune worth $860 million. She then would marry another senator, Bonesman John Forbes Kerry. John Kerry, whose ancestors were among the opium pioneers in China, investigated the Iran-Contra affair, unearthed Oliver North's private aid network to the Contras, and exposed the Bank of Commerce and Credit International, BCCI. He was given credit for his courage in attacking the mainstream corruption in Washington and intelligence drug dealing, but others say his investigation stopped short. The coincidences don't. Coincidence in the JFK assassination. The murder of President John Kennedy is a half-century old, but many believe it will never be solved. The first suspicions of foreign involvement, given credence by J. Edgar Hoover and Claire Booth Luce, were quickly discredited. Luce had said an anti-Castro agent had called her 300 from the sacred to the profane the day JFK was killed, and said Oswald was a communist. 21 The next victim of suspicion was the American right wing, as allegedly someone named George Bush tipped off the authorities of the assassination plot. The next suspects were organized criminals, such as the Mafia, and even Texas oil producers. Finally, the American CIA took over as the most likely culprit. Surveys of skeptics of the Warren Commission report, which Alan Dulles predicted no one would ever read, indicate that the CIA was the power behind the conspiracy. One skeptic was Robert Kennedy, who asked CIA Director John McCone point-blank, "Did the CIA kill my brother?" 22 McCone said no. A motive for the murder of President Kennedy could be that he had failed to take back Cuba, and this threatened other Caribbean islands, where United Fruit and a handful of sugar companies reaped the rewards of exploitative capitalism. Another motive might be that Kennedy had threatened to end the Vietnam Profit Center, which brought fortunes to the numerous blue blood investments in aviation, particularly Textron, which owned Bell Helicopter, and the Brown and Root Construction Company, which had provided Lyndon B. Johnson with his campaign war chest. This chapter will not attempt to solve the mystery of the Kennedy assassination, but it will try to shed light on some of the awkward coincidences that authors of the Warren Commission report, such as Kennedy haters Earl Warren and Alan Dulles, believed no one would ever read. The conspiracy as traced by the Warren Commission may have started when a young Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald